U.S. President Donald Trump has lashed out at Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy after he complained about Kyiv's exclusion from talks about Ukraine's future. Trump appeared to blame Zelenskyy for Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
I think I have the power to end this war, and I think it's going very well. But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. But they chose not to do it that way. And President Biden, in all fairness, he doesn't have a clue. What he was so bad for this. He was so bad, so pathetic. It's so sad.
Trump's comments there after U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in Saudi Arabia without Ukrainian or European representatives, for that matter. Rubio declared that Moscow and Washington wanted to work towards ending the war in Ukraine in a way that he described as enduring, sustainable, and acceptable to all sides. It was the first high-level meeting between the two countries since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
A rare moment of diplomacy as top Russian and U.S. officials wrapped up their first talks aimed at ending the Ukraine war. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met with U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a major turnaround after relations had sunk to their lowest point in decades.
Today is the first step of a long and difficult journey, but an important one. And President Trump is committed to bringing an end to this conflict. The other two is beginning to engage in identifying the extraordinary opportunities that exist should this conflict come to an acceptable end.
Both sides agreed on establishing a process for settling the conflict in Ukraine. But Lavrov said that NATO expansion poses a direct threat to Russia, as would sending European peacekeepers to Ukraine.
We explained today that the deployment of troops from those same NATO countries under another flag, the EU flag or the national flags of these countries, doesn't change anything. It is, of course, unacceptable for us.
In addition to restoring strained ties, the talks in Riyadh were intended to pave the way for a future meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Though the conditions for the meeting were discussed, so far no date has been set.
Let's take a closer look and bring in Peter Trubowitz. He teaches international relations at the London School of Economics. Peter, welcome to DW. Let's start with Donald Trump's striking comments, seemingly blaming Ukraine for the war. He's basically picking up Putin's talking points there. What is this all about?
Well, good morning, Nicole. Good to be with you. If anyone believes Trump's assertion that Kyiv started the war, I have a bridge in Brooklyn that I'd like to sell them. This is nothing short of strategic gaslighting and should be seen for what it is, an effort to structure the negotiations over the war in a way that is less about guaranteeing Ukrainian security than, I think, realigning U.S.-Russian relations. This is really what the meeting between American and Russian diplomats in Saudi Arabia really was about, and what I think really everyone should be keeping their eyes on as this story unfolds in the coming days and weeks.
To what end is he seeking that realignment?
Well, I mean, he meaning Trump or he meaning Putin? Trump, yeah. I think for Trump, this is this kind of stunning turnaround, bringing, if you will, Russia in from the cold, has all the trappings of grand theater. It's bold, it's dramatic, it's a surprise. And that's, I think, really what he's focused on. He is focused on the geopolitical and the, kind of diplomatic advantages that realigning the relationship with Russia in his mind offers. And that includes, I think, partly putting pressure on Europe and taking advantage of Europe's dependence on the United States, both its market, but also American security, and in Trump's mind, opening up the possibility of gaining leverage over China by realigning relations with Russia. Putin's got his own game. It's a different game, but, I think both of them see the negotiations over Ukraine as an opportunity to do something, to make strategic moves that are much larger than the war itself.
Yeah, so from what you're saying, this is not a one-off. It sounds like the days of isolating Russia and its authoritarian leader are officially over. Will Ukraine's European allies have to follow suit then if this is a new order, so to say, that Trump and Putin are pursuing?
Well, that's the question for the Europeans right now. And, frankly, looking at the meeting yesterday and then the earlier meeting, they're not on the same page. It's pretty obvious. And I think Trump knows that there's going to be divisions. And, Europe has trouble and has always had trouble effectively moving with unanimity on security questions that, where the United States is not leading. And so I think that the U.S. has effectively sidelined Europe in these negotiations, and Europe has to decide whether or not it's going to try to lead. And and right now, if I were Zelenskyy, I would not feel very confident about Europe's ability to lead right now.
Yeah. Overall, we're seeing Donald Trump upending decades of U.S. policy. How risky is that for him? Could that backfire?
It's possible. I mean, I think, I think the real question for Trump is how much he can concede to Putin diplomatically and get away with it domestically in the United States. And my guess is that he can concede a fair amount. Republicans are basically mute. I mean, if you just look at the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and the positions he's taking right now with respect to Russia, if you had asked someone whether he would be taking that position a year ago, the answer, I think, would be no.
That was Peter Trubowitz, professor of international relations at LSE. Thank you so much. Great speaking to you.
Good speaking with you.
And for more, let's bring in DW Bureau Chief Yuri Rochetto. He's been based in Riga since DW was banned from operating in Russia. And our correspondent, Nick Connolly, who is standing by in Kyiv. Good morning to both of you. Nick, let's start by talking about these truly striking remarks by U.S. President Trump, seemingly blaming Ukraine for Russia's aggression. How's this going down in Ukraine?
Lots of people here in Kyiv this morning scratching their heads. I think they guessed that this might be coming, right? This is, after all, an American president who talks about annexing other territories, Canada, Greenland, Panama. So this is not a person who, in terms of values, is particularly against what Vladimir Putin has tried to do here in Ukraine, rolling into a neighboring country and taking it over. That is not something that he sees as intrinsically something to work against, something to condemn. So that is obviously something, a very bitter kind of fact of Trump's view of the world that people here are having to deal with today. And I think more broadly, they're just coming to the conclusion that basically Trump seems to be negotiating about Russia's initial war aims, right? It feels like we're back in 2022, that the Russians are still demanding basically that Ukraine totally disarms, gives up any chance of defending itself, and that Trump is kind of giving a lot to Russians, but it's not really clear from Ukraine's perspective what he's asking for in return.
Mm-hmm. Yuri, let's take this right over to you, because U.S. officials have been talking about the need for concessions on both sides for a deal to be made. What could those be for Russia?
I think, Nicole, this will be the most difficult point of discussion because the Russians are obviously now currently in a better negotiation position than they were during the last peace talks in Turkey almost 3 years ago. The Russians are now militarily at least stronger in Ukraine. And that is why they are only sending, let's say, weak and in some cases contradictory signals for concessions, possible concessions. For example, there was talk yesterday that Moscow has nothing against Ukraine's EU membership, but that was never a real issue before, unlike Ukraine's NATO membership. Then Putin said he was ready to negotiate with Zelenskyy personally, if necessary. At the same time, however, Putin denies the legitimacy of Zelenskyy, and the same Putin said a few days ago, okay, we can negotiate with whomever we like, but the peace treaty must be signed by the legitimate leadership of Ukraine. So, in his logic, not by Zelenskyy. This means that it's still far too early to talk about real concessions.
We'll get to that point a little later with Nick, too, because now Donald Trump is also saying that Ukraine needs to have elections. But I want to talk about Zelenskyy for a second first. He has postponed his visit to Saudi Arabia. How frustrated, Nick, and annoyed probably, is he about being excluded from these high-level talks that we're seeing for the first time since this war started?
Well, we're definitely seeing a change of tone from Zelenskyy, whereas in the first kind of couple of days around that first Trump call to Putin, you really got the sense that the Ukrainian leadership was biting its lip, and how frustrated they were, however angry they were about the messaging, they weren't coming out and calling it out as strongly as, for instance, the Europeans were, because they were keen to basically stay on the right side of Trump, keep those connections going. And we are seeing Zelenskyy being a lot more vocal and a lot more visibly frustrated at what's going on, and repeating time and time again that, you, Trump, can make whatever deal you want with the Russians, but if I'm not there, I don't see that deal as having any validity and any kind of power over what I'm going to do. So I think there is a kind of real tightrope that's being walked right now. And there's also a sense here in Kyiv that also Trump is someone who respects strength. If you give in to him too quickly, if you let him steamroll you into deals, then he's not going to take you seriously. One small example, that deal on rare earth metals, we're now being brought to kind of understand from lots of different briefings that when the US officials were here in Kyiv last week, they were trying to force him into signing it and signing away basically lots of Ukraine's resources, also its ports, other kind of strategic assets. And then even at the Munich conference, there were reports that there was a threat to basically cancel all meetings between Zelenskyy and J.D. Vance if Zelenskyy didn't sign it there on the ground in Munich. He didn't, and the meeting still went on. But there is seemingly a lot of pressure being put on them, and they're now starting to push back.
Yuri, the EU or Ukraine's European partners and allies are, of course, also very, very desperate to get a seat at the table here and get to shape the outcome of possible negotiations. We saw Sir Keir Starmer of the UK positioning himself, talking about possibly sending peacekeepers to Ukraine. Sweden soon chimed in. That is an idea that Russia has called unacceptable. Do you see them accepting any kind of security guarantees for Ukraine after a peace deal that we're talking about right now is struck?
Well, look, we've just heard Foreign Minister Lavrov in the report. He said that Russia would not accept European soldiers as peacekeepers because they were NATO soldiers anyway. That could perhaps be understood as a signal that Russia could accept other soldiers. I wouldn't be too surprised, Nicole, if the Russians came up with the idea of positioning Belarusian soldiers as peacekeepers, their allies in the war, or Chinese or Indian troops. In any case, troops outside of NATO. Basically, however, the Russians are not interested in security guarantees for Ukraine, but in their own security guarantees. Above all, that Ukraine would never join NATO. That was the condition of President Putin from the beginning, and this is one of his most important goals.
Nick, U.S. President Donald Trump has picked up some of the Kremlin's talking points over the past days. He's also suggested that Ukraine needs to have elections, something that we've been hearing come out of Moscow for months, if not years. They don't think that Zelenskyy is a legitimate leader. What do Ukrainians think about the issue?
Look, I think Ukrainians were used to this coming as a kind of mantra from Russia for the last couple of years, but especially since, regular elections would have happened had it not been for the war and kind of wartime powers in 2024. I think they are really worried that now Trump has picked this up. We even had Trump saying that Zelensky's poll ratings were around 4%, which is very much not where they are. They're a lot close to 50%. Where he got those figures from, we don't know. And I think, on the one hand, if you look at the kind of formalities, Ukraine's parliament has voted to keep the kind of state of war in place, which means that obviously no elections allowed by the constitution. But also even Zelensky's political enemies are not calling for an election. Even people who criticize him daily for all kinds of things. And even in the wider Ukrainian society, you don't see a real push for elections. People say, yes, we're not happy with everything Zelensky's doing, but let's wait till after these, the hostilities are at least frozen. And even logistically, how are you going to get Ukrainians, millions of whom are spread across Europe, millions of, at least 1 million are in uniform along the front lines, how are you going to get them all to the ballot box and ensure a fair, kind of free election? Not to speak about the kind of potential for real kind of political strife between Ukrainians, right? If you're fighting in the trenches together, then suddenly you're asked to decide on politics. That could really undermine the unity of the Ukrainian army. And I think that's probably why Russia wants these elections so badly.
Nick, you say that many people in Ukraine saw this coming. Is there a sense that Ukraine's partners, especially in Europe, did not?
I think there's lots of magic thinking, right? So there was obviously a lot of worry about Trump during the election campaign when his poll ratings, were doing well, and it was clear that he was the favourite. But they haven't. What have they done to actually kind of prepare Ukraine? The outgoing Biden administration at least sent lots of weapons in the last couple of months, so that Ukraine has a bit of a kind of cushion in case Trump decides to pull the plug on military aid. But more broadly, there is a sense that Europe was in a kind of shock situation, and they just kind of in slow motion saw this coming and haven't really offered anything up to help. There's talk now of huge new aid packages in terms of military and kind of economic aid. We haven't seen the details of that. The big thing obviously that Ukraine wants is for Russia's foreign reserves that were frozen at the beginning of the war to be confiscated and given to Ukraine to help finance the army, rather than just what's happening right now, where Ukraine gets the proceeds from the interest payments but not the actual capital. It is a very, very difficult situation, and right now the Ukrainians realize that they have to double down on their efforts to get the Europeans to do more and not just say more, because right now they wake up every morning to the strangest statements coming out of DC and are realizing that the US just isn't a reliable ally right now.
This is Nick Connolly in Kyiv and DW's Yuri Roshetto in Riga. Many thanks to you both. Great to speak to you.